With that, please join me in welcoming Commissioner Mersinger, and she'll have some opening remarks.
All right, make sure my mic's in a good spot here. Well, thank you guys for inviting me and allowing me to speak with all of you today. I think Michael and I are going to have a good chat. We've already found that we have plenty to talk about and a lot in common, so that'll be fun. But you're probably wondering a little bit, why am I here? We are the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. What that means is we oversee the futures markets on commodities. So we don't actually oversee the commodity markets where you buy and sell oil. We regulate the markets where they are looking at kind of a derivative of that transaction. So a futures price, an option, a swap. Those are the markets we regulate. And what is interesting is, we have a lot of traditional energy futures and options trading that goes on, whether it's crude oil or natural gas. But we are seeing a shift into newer types of contracts that kind of are starting to fit into this environmental and energy complex. So we are looking now at, we've got futures trading on voluntary carbon markets. So where we used to kind of sit pretty, squarely in a certain area of energy and environmental space, we're seeing that shift a little bit. So I've been out trying to get to know just more about, some of the markets that are trading that maybe are involved more broadly with the energy and environmental complex. And just to give you a little bit of background a little more background on the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, we actually started as a small piece of the Department of Agriculture. In fact, we didn't move out of the Department of Agriculture until the 70s. And this all started because at the time, when you were a producer, you would take your seed or whatever, wheat, corn, and you'd put it in a warehouse and they'd give you a receipt for that. And people started trading those receipts. And what happened was, because there wasn't kind of regulation, people could kind of corner the markets and manipulate that. And so the Department of Agriculture and Congress decided, we probably need some federal oversight. And so that's where we started, in wheat, corn, oats, and we have grown just exponentially. In the 2008 Dodd-Frank bill, they added, the swap markets. And so, we went from this agency that was really looking at pretty physical commodities and the futures trading on those, to this new area where we're talking about really complex financial instruments. But we've maintained being a small agency, just a little over 700 people, and really able to oversee a market that we kind of let develop and innovate without a lot of government overreach. And so we are headed up by a 5-person commission. So we have, there will always be no more than 3 members of any one political party. So whoever the president is right now, President Biden, so there are 3 Democrats on our commission and 2 Republicans. I'm one of 2 Republicans on the commission. And we look at everything from, whether it's a enforcement action in our space to new rulemaking over our markets. All that comes up to the commission for a vote. And we also have advisory committees that we bring in stakeholders who kind of help us with policy and make sure that we're moving in the right direction. We are not necessarily the market experts, we are the regulators, and so we rely a lot on our stakeholders to help inform what we do. And so the agency, like I said, we've grown a lot, but size-wise it's stayed pretty small, and there's a lot of innovation in our markets, and we continue to see new markets come online all the time. And again, that's kind of where we're seeing like voluntary carbon markets and metals and critical minerals, and we're just seeing a whole host of new markets crop up in in spaces that, you know, nobody was talking about 5-10 years ago. So it's been interesting, and we certainly learned, we're learning more and more about energy and some of the environmental markets that are out there as we see new products come online. And so this was a great opportunity to get to know what you all are doing and see kind of how your markets work. I can assure you, we are not here to regulate you. I do not believe that we need to expand our jurisdiction. I think we have enough to do, and we definitely don't need to go any further. So this is actually, for me, more of a learning opportunity than anything to be here at this conference.
Thank you. I've got a couple questions we'll get started with, but I would encourage everyone, please use the app and submit your questions online. I'll certainly be monitoring that. And then as we go along, this is meant to be a fireside chat, so I'd encourage you, if you have a question almost at any time, please raise your hand. We'll have people with roving mics around the room, and we'll make sure to get those to you. One of the things that, when I was looking at the CFTC, just understanding you do have different committees, and I think you chair one on the energy and the environment. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about that committee and what environmental markets mean to you through that commission or that advisory commission work?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of government agencies have advisory committees, but I think we use ours a bit differently than other government entities. So we really do use these advisory committees as the opportunity for stakeholders to help us build policy and help us kind of find the right places in the regulations where maybe we need to make some changes or start regulating or stop regulating. And so we have 5 advisory committees at the CFTC. We've got the Agriculture Advisory Committee, we have Market Risk Advisory Committee, Global Market Advisory Committee, Technology Advisory Committee, and Energy and Environmental Markets Advisory Committee. And when we were sworn in, you know, we kind of were able to choose which advisory committee we wanted to head. I'm from South Dakota. All my family's in agriculture. They're all farmers. So normally everyone would kind of assumed I was going to take the Agriculture Advisory Committee. But I had worked on that for a previous chairman, and in my mind, I really wanted to focus on energy. I hadn't even really thought about the environmental market side of this. I wanted to focus on energy because, to me, that was one of the biggest driving, you know, cost drivers for agriculture. And I thought this is a good way to talk about agriculture somewhere other than this one committee where we've kind of stuck all agricultural discussions. So my thought was, we're going to talk about energy markets, and we're going to focus on how this impacts agriculture. But as I selected this advisory committee, but as I'm talking to my advisor, the members of my advisory committee, everyone really started talking about newer markets with the kind of greening of the economy and the energy transition and, you know, this new importance in metals, critical minerals. And so we kind of shifted in that direction, and we've started talking about where we see kind of emerging markets and new products coming up. So, you know, certainly we're spending a lot of time. In fact, we're working on a report that will be the first of the kind in the federal government about the critical metals and minerals, rare earth minerals markets, what those look like, and kind of the who's in those markets, how are they trading, will there, you know, if there are derivatives products on those, what that looks like, and then also kind of underlying energy infrastructure. You know, what goes into the price of your electricity, and how does that impact the markets and how those trade. And then, of course, you know, things like carbon markets come up in that space too. And we really are just kind of collecting information. We've done a lot of site visits to just a variety, whether we went to Cushing, Oklahoma, and saw where all the crude oil comes in and where our WTI oil contracts are settled. We were at a mine in Utah run by Rio Tinto. We've kind of just been really trying to understand the energy markets broadly. And again, you all have a very interesting market. It's nothing we regulate, but it plays into the broader, you know, context of these environmental markets. And so it's a learning opportunity and something that we've actually kind of brought into the discussion a little bit, so we understand what you all are doing in your markets.
Thank you. I think recently, it was in December, you may have published public comments for a guide, which I think you sort of equate to maybe being the equivalent like rulemaking for y'all, but a guide on the voluntary carbon market. I think the public comment period closed back in February of this year. I know several of you in the room are probably following that. Maybe any early insights on what you're seeing in those comments, what you hope the commission will actually be able to get out of that, and what was the real aim behind that guidance making or that rulemaking?
So I think the real aim was, the fact that we've got some of our exchanges now have derivatives, futures, contracts based on a number of these voluntary carbon markets that already exist. And there are a number of them out there, and it's been interesting looking at them because I think people expected them to maybe have a little more open interest, more trading. They're kind of slowly coming online, but this is a new emerging area, and when you look at these markets, one of the things that's important to us is that when you have a new contract, that it's not subject to fraud and manipulation, and that you feel pretty confident in the underlying, what we call cash market, where people are buying and selling these credits, that you feel like that's a pretty robust market and you can offer this kind of secondary futures product over it. And what we realized is there's the appetite for the futures product and the price discovering and the hedging that comes with that, but there were a lot of questions around the cash market. And so the guidance, the intention is guidance to our registered exchanges for what they should look for when they're basing a derivatives product off of a voluntary carbon market. They have a lot we have rules for them on any contract, and my feeling has always been, we shouldn't be treating any one sector differently. The rules are the rules, and you apply them regardless of the type of, the underlying commodity. But I think, this guidance attempted to say, well, there may be a few more things you need to think about when you're offering a derivatives product based on the underlying carbon market, and a lot of questions around, how they're verifying those, additionality, whether this was something that was already going to remove carbon from the atmosphere or not release the carbon, and now somebody's just taking credit for it. And so the idea was to try to help put some parameters around what to look for in the underlying market when our exchanges are picking, which products they're going to settle their contract to. The danger here is that we might be inadvertently or maybe advertently setting rules for that underlying carbon market through our exchanges. That's not our role. We do not have regulatory authority over the cash market for the voluntary carbon market, and we certainly shouldn't be creating rules for that. So it's that fine line of making sure that our exchanges are doing what they need to do to make sure their contracts are solid and not subject to fraud and manipulation, without stepping over that line and saying to the underlying cash market, we think you need to be doing X, Y, and Z to be a valid voluntary carbon market. And a lot of the comments, on either, very different depending on who was making the comment. Our exchanges, our registered exchanges, said you might have gone too far, and this feels a little bit like rulemaking, and you're asking us to do something that you can't even do, and we can't regulate these markets any more than you can. And then a lot of, if you look at the more traditional environmental groups that maybe said you didn't go far enough. You need to have stricter policies to allow these contracts on these carbon markets. So it was definitely a mixed bag. Where we go from here, it's hard to say. Again, this was guidance. We do have to vote on it at the end of the day. And so, it's up to the chairman of the agency to decide how he's going to tailor what's already in the guidance and bring it to the full commission for a vote. To me, I voted for the proposal because I do like getting these questions out there to get public feedback. I think that's a good exercise. But at the end of the day, I do think whatever our final guidance is, it needs to be that. It needs to be guidance. It shouldn't be prescriptive. It shouldn't be overly detailed. And it should give our regulated regulated entities an ability to decide for themselves the best way to, what underlying voluntary carbon market they're going to decide to use as kind of their base for settlement.
And just to clarify, because I want to get straight in my head, what you have most jurisdiction over is sort of the resale of those credits, but your underlying premise was you were concerned about sort of the on-the-ground restoration and what was really happening, possibly double selling of certain credits or maybe projects not being implemented. So you're trying to get sort of one layer down to see, not to put in too simplistic of a term, like, did the trees get planted? Like, was this acre sold once or twice? Is that really what you were trying to drive down to?
Yeah, and I think that's what we wanted to avoid, with our regulatory authority. And we have a really interesting, the way our authority was set up by Congress is really interesting. Our regulation is very specific over these secondary markets, your futures, your options, your swaps, those markets. But at some point in time during Dodd-Frank, the Congress said to us, you know what, we think you need to be able to go after fraud and manipulation in the cash market, because a lot of times that's going to have an impact on your secondary market. So you should be able to go bring an enforcement case against any fraud and manipulation in the underlying market. And so that sometimes puts us in a strange situation. So we use cattle as an example a lot in my office because that's what I understand. Cattle futures market, CME, all of their futures products on cattle, that's squarely within our regulatory remit and also squarely within our enforcement remit. But if someone is manipulating the sale, buying and selling of cattle, we actually can bring an enforcement case against that person, and we have. And so it puts us in this strange situation where, somebody who is maybe committing fraud at a cattle sale barn, that really shouldn't be anything that we're worried about, but now we have the authority to do that. And so with the voluntary carbon markets, we now have enforcement authority over those markets. And I think this is where it gets difficult, and one thing that I've really been concerned about, as a commissioner is I don't think we're not the right agency to go in and say, and check, did those trees really get planted? Did that rainforest really get, is that rainforest still standing? Did you properly measure the emission or the lack of the emission? But we're kind of in that situation, and depending on who's in charge, your enforcement team can be more or less aggressive. I think our current enforcement team has been very aggressive, and we have put out a notice for whistleblowers and have a task force looking for fraud and manipulation in the underlying voluntary carbon markets. It'll be very interesting when we see a case related to this, because again, this is a new territory for us. We're not experts here. And it also will be interesting because I guess the question is then for our exchange, if it's a voluntary carbon market that they are using as the underlying market for settling these contracts, and we bring in a fraud and manipulation case in that particular market, do they now have some sort of responsibility to change their futures contract because there's fraud and manipulation in the underlying market? So it's kind of an interesting bifurcation of our powers, and it gets even more interesting when you're talking about things like voluntary carbon markets, because it's very hard to track fraud and manipulation in those markets right now.
Yeah, what I'm really struck by is the thing you're trying to go figure out is what we, along with our federal and state partners, spend several years living in, and is really verifying that work that's being done on the ground. We obviously don't need to tell this crowd, but we spend a couple years in the permitting process, and then we spend years in the monitoring phases of our banks to make sure that those credits are real. What I think we don't think about is, like, what are the real markets that we're selling into? What are the secondary markets that could exist? And how do we start to think about the credits we have possibly serving other markets that would be out there, which is where you're living right now. Yeah. One of the questions that came in online was really like, what's the nexus between the voluntary carbon market, the work that they're doing, and wetland mitigation banks?
Yeah. No, it's a great question, and we talked a little bit about this before. I mean, I think there's actually a lot to learn from what you all are doing with your credits, and how you're able to, the fact that this is a market that's been around. You've got the regulators who can verify the credit. That's done up front. You're retiring them. There's a lot of kind of certainty that you have in your mitigation credits that I think would help the voluntary carbon market. And so I actually think there's a lot that the voluntary carbon markets could be learning from what you've already established, and that seems to be kind of a piece that's lacking. And so, I think that's one side of it is, are there lessons learned that you all have learned long before that can help this kind of new, market that is growing exponentially and very fast and a little bit scary sometimes. And then it's also, is this, I say this to farmers all the time, like, is this a new opportunity, a new opportunity to, for an additional source of revenue? I don't know, that's a question for you all, but, when you think about it, a lot of what you're doing is kind of what some of these voluntary carbon credits, are envisioning doing, and it's that, you're kind of reestablishing, the environment to where it was, and taking it, making a financial credit from that, and that's really what kind of the carbon markets are trying to do. And so, there seems to be a lot of synergy there, and it might be an opportunity to add on to what you guys are already doing.
Well, I think we've certainly had conversations, I think, during this conference and in previous ones about multi-purpose banking, and then figuring out how do we really assess all the different environmental functions and values, and possibly separate them out or sell them into other markets where we see a higher return on that investment. Again, for the audience, please, if anyone's got a question, raise your hand. I think we've got several people walking around with microphones. So please don't let me miss a question in the audience if there is one.
I always say I got 4 kids, and when we sit around at the dinner table, I get a lot of weird questions. So there is no question that you can ask me that I won't be prepared to at least make something up and answer. So.
I think we've got a couple here in the front.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Compared to corn, right, with really physical commodity that you can take physical possession of and move somewhere else, I get that as a commodity, but environmental assets are all over the place, right?
Yeah.
So biochar you can move around, but real estate-based wetland credits you can't, versus avoided loss carbon projects, which only have additionality in an equation, kind of don't even exist in the real world, right? They're just a contract document. And so how do you, I guess what I'm asking is, can we resolve that at all? And is it important whether it's an asset, a certificate, or a contract, right, or kind of a real estate structure?
Yeah, no, I struggle with this with some of our contracts that are allowed under our act, because when you think about our secondary markets based on physical commodities, it makes a lot of sense. When you take that physical commodity out of there and you have something like an interest rate, or we have what are called event contracts, where it's just like, will this happen or that happen? Will there be a weather event in Florida? It gets very hard when you take that physical commodity out of there. But I will say, our markets have figured out kind of how to do that. There's a lot of it is, coming up with benchmarks, something, you have to settle to something. And so if you've got a commodity and there's not a physical underlying, thing, the idea is, okay, how are we going to price this? What's going to be the settling price? And so this is where we see indexes come in, kind of these places where maybe they're talking to the people who are selling these things back and forth, and not everything is exact exactly the same, but you can kind of come up with a, pool of information to have a price to settle to. And so that's kind of how some of these things work. But I will also say there are going to be transactions, everywhere that just don't necessarily lend themselves to a derivatives market. And, that's okay too, I think. Just because something exists and could probably be considered a commodity doesn't necessarily mean it's fit for purpose for a derivatives contract or a secondary market. And it's figuring that out. And a lot of times it is, does this thing exist that gets bought and sold? Is it pretty standardized? Are there industry standards? Are there things that you can look at where you can say, yeah, it might not be the same, but it's pretty equivalent, and so their pricing is similar enough that you could kind of pull it together. So I think it's just trying to decide, is this kind of fit for purpose for the secondary market? And, I think that is one of the problems with voluntary carbon credits. I'm still not sure they're fit for purpose for derivatives trading because there's so many strange pieces to the underlying that, I think it raises some questions.
Thank you, Summer and Chris, for being here. Great to hear this, the input. And I think you all do a lot of kind of market principle work. Yep. And so one of the questions I had is, taking the regulatory hat off, is kind of insights. And one of the questions in this industry has always been two things: experience with price transparency and the role that has played in markets. A lot of this industry has fought that for years. And it's still a raging debate within the industry. And then the second thing is frameworks for secondary markets. And I think some folks are exploring it, particularly in the regulatory market dynamic we're in. And we're told by some of the regulatory agencies we can't do it, we can't keep track of it, it's too hard. And so it'd be great to hear insights on both of those.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on the, kind of, the framework side, I will say that's one thing that our agency is very good at, is kind of helping not necessarily showing people how to set up these markets, but kind of helping to demonstrate some of the frameworks and explain, what's needed to have a vibrant and liquid secondary market. And one of the things that we do, which I think is kind of very unique for a financial regulator in the federal space, is we're called in a lot to foreign countries who are just starting to set up some of these derivatives markets to help them build that out. It is interesting because they usually have very different underlying cash markets, and so we're trying to help them build a framework for a secondary market when their cash market might not look anything like ours. And so the idea is we're just trying to tell them what works in our space, what we've seen, how our markets are set up, and just try to give them what we call technical assistance to do this. At the end of the day, if it works, if it works, great. If it doesn't, that's not our concern. We're just in there to be, a resource. So I think, the frameworks, there's not a set kind of, it must be this way. It really does depend on what the underlying market is. And so, we just try to provide some best practices. And now I've got to remember your first question. Price transparency. Price transparency, it doesn't work everywhere, right? Like, there are some places where price transparency maybe is not what, it always sounds great. It really, it's a great talking point, price transparency, but it doesn't always work, and it's not always the right thing for every market. And so, our focus on price transparency is that our derivatives market should provide that. So if we're going to have a contract, if we're going to have a futures contract, we want it to be very transparent in how pricing is handled. And this is where we have some issues with current contracts. So again, going back to cattle, one of my favorite kind of illustration, cattle markets have been a little bit difficult lately because there are so many direct contracts between the feedlot and the processors and the rancher, and those prices don't get reported. So if the only price is getting reported are in the sale barn and that is starting to shrink, then we have to start asking, do these future contracts still work? In fact, you'll see some legislation in Congress on forcing some price reporting from those bilateral contracts to help kind of bolster the price transparency. But at the end of the day, that's one where it used to be everything was done in the public sale barn, and everyone's used to that, and now it's moving to more bilateral contracts. There are markets where bilateral contracts is just the norm. And so in those space, it might not, secondary market is going to be more difficult because you've always had more bilateral contracts. There may be contracts that aren't as, there may be more bespoke. They're not as, they're not as, they're not economically equivalent is a term we like to use. And so it is difficult to say that, you need price transparency. We say you need price transparency in a secondary market because that's kind of the reason they exist. And a lot of that is, again, hedging. If you are, say you're McDonald's and you want to know how much beef is going to cost 6 months from now, that's what the futures market is for. And you want that price to be pretty transparent. You want to know how we got there and why the futures contract looks the way it does. Again, when you have bilateral agreements, it might not be the same. And we found that with swaps. A lot of swaps are very bespoke and they're bilateral, and the government said, well, we do want these to go through what we call a clearinghouse, but the entities can still kind of contract on their own and come to an agreement and then move it to a clearinghouse. And so we have had to adapt a little bit and allow that setup where we can't tell you exactly what that swap's going to look like, but we recognize that the second piece of that, which is the clearinghouse side, that's an important piece to it, but we don't want to get into your contract terms.
No, we talked a little bit about this. We certainly pride ourselves on our relationship with our clients, and I think probably everyone here is in a bilateral contract. And so one of the things you had touched on, I think George was getting to this, you talked about the support you provide to our foreign allies and our foreign partners, but do you do the same thing for any of those in the federal space as well, and or the states?
Yeah, I mean, we are pretty open to helping people out. I would say because we're a small agency, we're more approachable, and because we have this unique experience, we do have people that come to us for help. So if states are looking to set something up that looks similar to some of our, if they're looking to set something up that doesn't fall into our regulated space, but it looks a little bit similar to what we do, we offer this technical assistance, and we also offer it within the federal government. So a great example of this is the EPA and the renewable tax credits, the RINs market. That's a market that looks very similar to what we do. Congress said, EPA, you're going to do this. EPA is not a market regulator. They are a market nothing, but they got handed this market, and it has been very difficult for them to figure out, like, okay, what does fraud and manipulation look like in this space? What should the proper trading look like? And so more than once, EPA has come to us with their data and said, help us figure this out. What are we looking at here? What should we be looking for? And so we've done help on the side of, like, what does a normal, what should normal trading look like? We've had our enforcement team help them identify what fraud or cornering and squeezing in the market looks like. And at the end of the day, when we're done offering help, we just hand it back to them. Come tell us when you need help again, but we're not in charge of this. And I always, with the RINs market especially, I always say, that's not our market. We're not in charge. We're happy to help, but happy to hand it back to the EPA when we're done helping too. So it's just it's a service, and I really do think it's unique to our agency as far as financial regulators. There are not a lot of financial regulators going to foreign countries and working with some of our like USAID and some of our international agencies to help them set up these markets, and it's really about economic development in those spaces.
And we're down to a few last questions, or a few last minutes. One more question from the audience, and then we'll quickly wrap up.
Commissioner, thanks a lot for coming to visit us. Based on your experience with the carbon market, how do you see the difference between regulated markets and voluntary markets? Because we know that's one of the risks. Right now, there is a lot of innovation in the voluntary nature market, and a lot of the stuff that's talked about, I'm like, you're creating securities, and you're definitely creating secondary markets there, and that's creating an existential risk for the industry. Most of us are not, able to have the level of compliance that you will require. So how do we keep those guys at bay so that if they get regulated, fine, but we don't run that risk?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the good news is you guys have a regulator. You have both the state and federal, so that helps. But it is tough because you don't want to create a product that looks just like what we regulate and have somebody come in and say, you know what, you just created a futures product, and now the CFTC is going to regulate you. And this is a question that comes up a lot in when you start talking about cryptocurrencies too. We're creating this. We don't want the government knocking on our door, but people are inadvertently some are definitely trying to, but others are just kind of accidentally stepping over that line. And I think the big thing is, as you're starting to look at new things and new projects and new markets, one of them is, to engage, the regulators and maybe the regulators you're concerned about. So, at our agency, we do have people who come in and say, I'm going to do this. This isn't going to, you're not going to come in and bring an enforcement action against me, right? And we're, in a lot of cases, able to say, you know what, no, that doesn't, we're not worried about that, or that's not within our remit, or, that could be within our remit, but we really think that this is a good thing, so we're going to give you, we have like no action relief and those sorts of things where it says we're not going to bring in an investigation against you. And so it's really just that engagement and talking to our agency. And if you are looking at opportunities to, whether it's the voluntary carbon markets or whatever, I think it is a good idea to come in and talk to us. Again, we aren't going to turn you away, and we're also not going to show up at your door with a subpoena. So that's the good news. But I think it helps. It's always better to tell your story before somebody else is telling it for you.
Well, we're getting close to time now. I just want to say I've had two sort of things that have been rattling around in my head in our prep meetings and throughout this conversation today. And I think we've got some states represented in the room who are probably reaching out to the CFTC and asking them about possibly setting up platforms to bring some daylight to the markets, and probably pulling together multiple different credits onto a single platform and thinking about how do we bring maybe some durability to that. And hopefully through that, I would say, I think the end goal would be, does that attract capital to the things we're doing? Does that make the market more robust? So I don't think I'm spoiling too much on what we see Virginia doing. They've certainly been a leader in our space, and I think we've had a lot of discussion around what Mike and his team's been able to do. The other one we didn't get a chance to talk on it, and maybe we'll invite you back next year to talk on this, was how we think about the financial instruments we have to put in place. We talked a little about our long-term stewardship funds and the potentially hundreds of millions of dollars that are going into those around the country, and how are we managing those investments, and could we learn something from the CFTC? And so I think there's maybe some future conversation there around best practices that you have that could be brought to our regulators and to the markets we're operating in. And then finally, and I certainly would like you to have some closing comments, but I think the invitation is for us to start to get more engaged. They clearly have a subcommittee on environmental markets. They're trying to solve problems that we are living in every day. And I think we as an industry need to figure out how do we start to get more plugged in and provide that insight that we've painfully learned, I think, over the last 3-4 decades and are continuing to improve upon. So I think it's only in our best interest to figure out a way to start to meet you at your place and provide that insight. So I'll stop there. I want to thank everybody for all their questions, the participation. I'll turn it to you for maybe some closing comments.
Yeah, no, I'll keep it short, and you know, my door's open. Chris Lucas, my staff person over here, a few people know Chris. Chris is easy to reach via telephone, email, and we've been able to kind of help connect people. We are a market regulator that is very different from all the other financial regulators. We're even different from the SEC. So we have an interesting experience in helping, oversee markets of all kinds. And so, I think we are maybe one of the few places where, when the government shows up, I was thinking, the government shows up at your door, you're always a little worried. This might be one where it's not as scary. And again, it's not necessarily like we're not going to come knock on your door, but we welcome you to come knock on our door because we learn from you. And this is how we also learn not to over-regulate and step into a space that's already working, that doesn't need regulation. And so we need to know about what's going on so we don't make that mistake.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Please join me in giving her a round of applause.
Thank you guys for having me.